He almost missed it. Marcus Reeves had been walking property lines all morning, boots caked with red clay mud, clipboard under his arm, trying to convince an 81-year-old woman standing at her back screen door that he wasn't a trespasser. The October air smelled like wood smoke and cold creek water. A wind came through the hollow, and the screen door swung toward him, and then swung back, and something stopped him. He looked down. There was a stone wedged against the door frame, roughly the size of a shoebox lid, but thick, almost brick shape. The surface was rough, the color of old pewter and deep forest moss, catching the morning light in a way that didn't quite make sense for a piece of field rock. He kept talking. He was saying something about the university's survey, about the dry creek bed out past the pasture fence, about how he wouldn't disturb anything. But he had stopped hearing his own words. He crouched down slowly, the way you move around something you don't want to startle. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had changed. "Can I ask where you got this?" Edna Mae Calloway looked at him, the way she had looked at students who asked questions she hadn't expected. Measuring, not unkind, but not warm yet either. "That old thing," she said. "Calvin found it, back in the pasture." "When?" She thought about it. 79, maybe. 1979. He was putting in new fence posts. Marcus set his clipboard on the porch railing. He didn't reach for the stone. He just looked at it, tilting his head slightly, the way a person does when they're trying to reconcile what their eyes are showing with what their brain has filed away as impossible. "How long has it been out here?" he asked. "As a doorstop?" "Yes, ma'am." Edna considered. "Since Calvin died," she said. 83. "So 40 years, give or take." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "Would it be all right if I came back? With a colleague?" She looked at him for a long moment. The screen door shifted in the wind. The stone held it. "I'll make coffee," she said. Edna Mae Dawson had grown up 11 miles from where she stood, in a house with no insulation and a coal stove that her mother fed like a fifth child. Her father worked the mines. Her mother kept a kitchen garden and mended everything twice before letting it go. There were 4 children and 1 bedroom and a porch where her grandmother sat in the evenings telling stories about the land, as if the land itself had feelings, about which hills were proud, which hollows were sorrowful, which creek beds had given up treasure to the right hand. She had been a good student. Her 2nd grade teacher told her mother she had a gift for understanding. Her mother had looked at the teacher and said quietly that Edna also had a gift for stubbornness, and that in her experience, the 2 things usually traveled together. She earned a teaching certificate from Eastern Kentucky University in 1964. She taught 4th grade for 31 years at Gravel Hollow Elementary. She knew most of the children in the county in the way that small-town teachers come to know children, not just by name, but by what was happening at home, by which ones came to school hungry, by which ones had parents who read to them, and which ones would only ever be read to by her. She met Calvin Calloway at a church social in the summer of 1965. He was a quiet man from a farming family with large hands and a habit of thinking a long time before speaking that some people mistook for slowness. Edna had recognized it immediately for what it was. He was someone who didn't waste words. She had found that rare and beautiful. They married in 1967. By 1971, they had built the house at the end of Calloway Road. Calvin doing most of the framing himself with his brother Dale. Edna mixing mortar and handing up boards, and not once being asked to go inside and make sandwiches, because Calvin had known better. They had Donna in 1967, and a boy, James, who lived only 4 days in 1970. They did not speak of James often, but they did not forget him either. His name was on a small stone in the churchyard, and every spring Calvin left wildflowers on it without being asked. The back pasture was Calvin's project for years. He was always improving something: the fence line, the drainage, the condition of the soil near the creek. In the spring of 1979, he decided to relocate 3 fence posts that had been set wrong by a previous owner, set too close to the tree line where the roots would eventually work them loose. He dug the new post holes by hand, the way he did most things, methodically, without complaint. On the 3rd day, he hit something. He brought it to the house that evening, carrying it in both hands, the dirt still caked on it. He set it on the back porch and washed it with the hose. It came up greenish gray in the evening light, heavy and rough-surfaced, catching a certain quality of the fading sun that made it look almost like it was lit from inside. Pretty, Edna had said. Solid, Calvin had said, which was how he expressed approval of things. He had shown it to his brother Dale, who said it looked like some kind of crystal formation, maybe quartz, maybe something else. He didn't know. He had shown it to a man named Bud Akers, who worked a mineral claim up past the ridge. And Bud had looked at it and said it might have a little something in it, but it wasn't anything he'd seen before and probably wasn't worth the trouble of hauling anywhere. That was the end of the investigation. The stone was interesting, but not useful, or so it seemed. For a while, it sat on the porch railing. Then one spring, the back screen door started catching on its frame when the wind blew, and Calvin picked up the stone and wedged it against the base of the door. It worked perfectly. It was exactly the right weight. It stayed there. Calvin died in November of 1983. His heart. He was 51 years old, and he had seemed fine until he wasn't. The way that sometimes happens with men who are strong enough to hide the warning signs, even from themselves. Edna found him in the barn in the morning, already gone, slumped against the post he'd been leaning on to rest. She stood there for a long moment in the cold before she walked to the house to call Dale. In the weeks that followed, she made practical decisions the way you make them when grief is too large to look at directly. You clean, you arrange, you keep your hands busy. She gave away his good shirts. She kept his tools in the barn, organized the same way he'd kept them. She went back to teaching the Monday after the funeral because her students needed her and because she did not know how to be in the house all day yet. The stone stayed at the back door. She hadn't put it there, and she didn't move it. It was his. It had come from his hands and his ground, and it sat where he'd put it. And 40 years is how long it takes when something becomes part of the way a house breathes. In the fall of 2023, Edna's mornings had a particular order that she found comforting. She woke at 5:30 without an alarm. She started the coffee, the same percolator she'd had since 1989, and she had no intention of replacing it. She pulled on her cardigan and went out to the back porch in the gray light before the sun cleared the ridge, coffee in hand, and she stood there in the quiet while the day assembled itself. She was 81. Her knees had opinions about stairs. Her hands ached in cold weather in a way that Calvin would have understood because his had done the same. She had a doctor in Hazard she saw twice a year, and he told her she was in fine condition for her age, which she found a slightly irritating thing to say to a person, as if being fine for one's age was an achievement rather than simply the situation. She still drove to town on Tuesdays for groceries and Thursdays for Ruth. Ruth Hoskins lived 2 miles down the road in a white house with a rusted metal roof and a porch where she kept 11 potted plants in various stages of survival. She was 79 and had been Edna's closest friend for 46 years, since their children were in school together. Ruth had lost her husband Raymond to a stroke in 2007, and the two of them had developed a Thursday routine that involved Ruth's kitchen, strong tea, and complete honesty about the world that Edna found necessary for her mental health. On the Thursday, before Marcus Reeves appeared at her back door, Edna had told Ruth about Donna's most recent call. "She wants me to talk to someone at Meadow Glen," Edna said. Ruth knew what Meadow Glen was. Everybody in the county knew what Meadow Glen was. Assisted living, Ruth said. It wasn't a question. She says it's just a conversation, that I'd have my own apartment, that there's activities. Ruth wrapped both hands around her tea mug. What kind of activities? She didn't specify. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you having trouble?" "No more than last year." "Then what does she think is wrong?" Edna looked out Ruth's kitchen window at the brown fields. I think she's tired of worrying," she said. "I think it's easier for her if I'm somewhere she can picture." Ruth nodded slowly. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her I'd think about it." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "I'm not going anywhere," Edna said. "But I've learned that telling Donna I'm not going anywhere just makes her call more often." Ruth laughed, and the sound of it was the best part of Edna's Thursday. Donna Calloway Marsh was 56 years old and lived in Lexington with her husband Terry, who worked in insurance and had the manner of a person who had never once been surprised by anything. Donna called twice a week and visited at Thanksgiving and at Easter, and sometimes in the summer if Terry could get the time. She was a good daughter in the ways that were visible and sometimes difficult in the ways that were not. She had her father's hands and her mother's stubbornness, which Edna had observed was a combination that made people very effective and occasionally hard to be around. She meant well. Edna believed this completely. It did not make the calls easier. If you have someone in your life who has spent decades doing the quiet, invisible work of holding something together, a home, a memory, a piece of land, and the world around them has never quite seen it for what it was. Leave their name in the comments below, because this story is for them. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, a like and a subscription means more people find their way here. Marcus came back 4 days later. He brought a woman named Dr. Faye Sutton, who taught mineralogy at UK and wore her silver hair in a braid and carried a small leather case that she set on the porch railing with the care of someone setting down something fragile. Edna made coffee. She put out a plate of the oatmeal cookies she'd made 2 days before. Dr. Sutton asked if she could examine the stone where it was before touching it. Edna said yes. The woman crouched down in the same way Marcus had, and she looked at it for a long time with a small loupe she took from her coat pocket. Then she asked if she could hold it. The stone weighed about 10 pounds. Dr. Sutton turned it in her hands. She tilted it toward the morning light and then away from it. She held it toward the lamp, just inside the door, the old incandescent one Edna kept, because she liked the quality of the light. Something happened to the stone in that light. It shifted. The color changed, not dramatically, not like a magic trick, but unmistakably. The green-gray went warmer, darker, pulling toward a deep wine color at the heart of one of the crystal formations, something almost raspberry in the lamplight that hadn't been there in the daylight. Dr. Sutton said nothing for a moment. Then she looked at Marcus, and something passed between them that was too careful and too controlled to be casual. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "when your husband found this, do you know if anyone did a mineral identification at the time?" "A man named Bud Akers looked at it," Edna said. "He said it might have something in it, but he wasn't sure what." "Was Mr. Akers a geologist?" "He worked a mineral claim. I don't know if he had any training." Dr. Sutton nodded. She set the stone down carefully, not back at the door frame, but on the porch table, and she photographed it from 6 angles with her phone. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "I would like to take a very small sample, the size of a grain of rice, from an edge that's already fractured back to the laboratory. I want to be careful not to make any assumptions before we have proper analysis, but I want to be honest with you. I believe this specimen may be significantly more unusual than it appears." Edna looked at her steadily. "Unusual how?" Dr. Sutton measured her words the way Edna had always measured words, as if they had weight, and weight mattered. "That," she said, "is what I'd like to find out with certainty before I say anything more." Edna thought about Calvin bringing the stone home in his hands, the dirt still wet on it. She thought about the way he'd set it on the porch railing and washed it with the hose just to see what was under the mud. "All right," she said, "but it stays here until you know something definite." "Absolutely," Dr. Sutton said. That night, Edna sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and looked at the back door. The stone was back in its place. The screen door rested against it. She could hear the wind moving through the ridge behind the house, a sound she had heard every night for more than 50 years. She touched the small iron key in the ceramic dish on the windowsill, Calvin's key to the old pasture gate. She had kept it there since 1983. It was worn smooth where his thumb had pressed it daily for years. She had no idea what she was about to be standing in the middle of, but she had lived long enough to know that sometimes the ground shifts under your feet, and the only thing you can do is keep your footing and pay attention. The next 11 days passed in their ordinary way. Edna raked leaves. She drove to town on Tuesday. She had Thursday with Ruth and told her about the geologists and the color change in the lamplight, and Ruth listened the way she always listened, completely, without filling in the pauses. And when Edna was done, Ruth said, "What do you think it is?" "I don't know," Edna said. "I've never seen a stone change color like that." "Is it worrying you?" Edna thought about it. "No," she said. "It's interesting me." Ruth smiled. That sounds like you." On the 12th day, Marcus Reeves called and asked if he could come by. Not with Dr. Sutton this time, just him. He said he had some preliminary information and he wanted to share it with her in person rather than over the phone. She told him to come at 2 o'clock. What Marcus had not told her, what he would not tell her until much later. Sitting on her back porch in the spring after everything was settled, when the conversation had relaxed enough for true honesty, was what those 12 days had actually looked like for him. He had called Dr. Sutton the evening after their first visit, before he'd even gotten home. He had described the specimen over the phone with the careful language of someone who was trying very hard not to overstate what he'd seen, because overstatement was not something his training permitted. Dr. Sutton had listened without interrupting, and then said, "I'll clear my Thursday." In the laboratory, after the sample was analyzed, he had stood in front of the spectroscopy results for a long time. He had been a mineral geologist for 19 years. He had found interesting things. He had once located a vein of native copper in an unlikely formation in Harlan County that had excited 3 of his colleagues considerably. He had published 14 papers, supervised 11 graduate students, served on 2 federal advisory committees concerning Appalachian mineral resources. He had never seen anything like this, not the quality of the stone alone, though the quality was exceptional. It was the circumstances of it, the context. A woman in her 80s, in a house at the end of a gravel road, who had lived alongside something extraordinary for 40 years and had never known it, because no one had ever told her, because no one had ever looked. He had thought about that for 12 days, about what that meant, about how many things were sitting in how many houses and barns and back porches across the rural hill counties of Appalachia, unremarked and unexamined, because the people who lived with them were not the kind of people who got their things examined, because the expertise that might have noticed was elsewhere, because the systems that could have connected knowledge to need had never quite reached the end of Calloway Road. It made him think differently about the survey he'd been doing, about what a mineral survey was actually for, who it served, whether the knowledge being accumulated at the university was making its way to the people whose land it concerned. He thought about that for 12 days and did not say any of it to Edna on the afternoon he arrived at 2 o'clock because she hadn't asked, and he didn't want to make her history into a lesson. But it was there, underneath everything, shaping the particular care with which he spoke. She was in the kitchen at 1:50 when she heard his truck on the gravel. She took the coffee off the stove and set it on the table. She put out 2 mugs. She sat down and folded her hands and waited for what was coming. He came in through the back, same as before. He said hello. He accepted the coffee. He sat across from her, and he held the mug in both hands for a moment, and she recognized that gesture. It was the gesture of someone who was about to say something careful. Before you hear what Marcus was holding in his hands that afternoon, and you should know that what was in those preliminary lab results would change the way Edna thought about 40 years of mornings. I want to ask you something. Do you think the stone was worth what the experts suspected? Or do you think Bud Akers was closer to right all along? That it was curious, maybe beautiful, but ultimately just a piece of Appalachian rock? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if you're not subscribed yet, this would be a very good moment. Mrs. Calloway, Marcus said, the sample Dr. Sutton took came back from the lab yesterday. Edna nodded. The host rock is a regional pegmatite. That's not unusual for this part of Kentucky. The geological conditions are right for it. What's unusual is what's in it. He paused. The crystals in the specimen are chrysoberyl, a particular variety. I don't know that word, she said. Chrysoberyl is a mineral. On its own, it's relatively uncommon, but not extraordinary. But this particular variety, he stopped again, and she had the sense that he was being careful not to lead her anywhere too fast. There's a phenomenon called the alexandrite effect. It occurs in a very specific type of chrysoberyl where the chromium content interacts with light in a particular way. The stone appears green or blue-green in daylight or fluorescent light, in incandescent light, in candlelight, in an old lamp. It shifts toward red, toward raspberry, or sometimes deep purple red. Edna was quiet. She looked at her coffee. Like what we saw, she said, when Dr. Sutton held it near the lamp. Yes, ma'am, that's the alexandrite effect. And the reason it matters, he set his mug down. Alexandrite is one of the rarest gemstones on Earth, rarer than diamonds. The finest specimens have historically come from Russia, from the Ural Mountains, and from deposits in Brazil and Sri Lanka. There are small deposits in the United States, but documented finds of this quality, this size, this color saturation, particularly raw specimens in matrix like yours, still embedded in the host rock, are extraordinarily rare. Edna looked at him for a long moment. Outside, a wind moved through the trees at the edge of the pasture. Calvin Stone, she said. Yes, ma'am. He found it digging fence posts. Yes, ma'am. She looked at the back door. The stone was there, same as always. The screen door resting against it, the same October light falling on it that had fallen on it every October for 40 years. How rare, she said. Is extraordinarily rare? Marcus looked at his hands. Dr. Sutton is reaching out to a natural history specialist she knows in Cincinnati. We'd want a formal evaluation, provenance documentation, a full mineralogical report. I don't want to give you numbers that aren't validated. He met her eyes. But I think you deserve to know what we're talking about. The preliminary assessment, and this is preliminary, suggests the full specimen, the matrix and crystals intact, could be valued for auction or institutional acquisition somewhere between $800,000 and over $1 million. Edna did not react the way people react in movies. She didn't stand up. She didn't put her hand over her mouth. She looked at him steadily, the way she had looked at students who told her things she hadn't expected, and she said, "Calvan used it to hold the door open." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. His voice was gentle. "He did." She was quiet for a moment longer. Then she said, "Show me." "Ma'am." "The color. Show me what you're describing." He nodded. He went to the back door and picked up the stone. The first time he had held it, she noticed, even though this was his third visit. He held it with the same two-handed care that Dr. Sutton had used. He carried it to the table and set it in the shaft of afternoon light from the window, and it was green-gray and heavy and unremarkable in that light, same as always. Then he reached over and turned on the lamp, the old incandescent one on the kitchen counter, the one she kept lit most of the day because the kitchen was shaded on the north side and needed the warmth. The stone changed. It happened in a few seconds, gradually enough to feel real and fast enough to be astonishing. The green surface went deeper, went warmer, began to pull toward a color that Edna had no precise word for. Wine dark was close, and raspberry was close, and neither was quite right. The largest cluster of crystals on the face of the stone glowed in that lamp like something from a country she had never been to. She looked at it for a long time. "Calvan saw this," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Not necessarily," Marcus said gently. "He may have mostly seen it in daylight, or he may have noticed the color and just not had a reason to think much of it." "He noticed things," she said. "He was the kind of person who noticed." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. "I think that's why he kept it." She picked up her coffee mug. She took a slow sip. She set it back down. "All right," she said. "Tell me what comes next." What came next was methodical and slow, the way all things that actually matter tend to be. Dr. Sutton's contact in Cincinnati was a man named Gerald Voss, who ran a natural history specimens firm called Harlan and Voss. He was 62, precise in his language, and arrived in Gravel Hollow on a gray November morning with a colleague and a padded case of instruments that he spread on a back porch table with the seriousness of a surgeon. He examined a stone for 90 minutes. Edna made lunch and offered it. He accepted. They sat at the kitchen table, and he told her in careful detail what he had found. The specimen contained what he estimated to be 11 distinct alexandrite crystals in the matrix, ranging from small to one that was roughly the size of a man's thumb joint. The color change was exceptional, a shift from bluish-green in daylight to a deep rose-red under incandescent, which he described as among the strongest he had seen in a raw American specimen. The matrix was intact, undamaged, which increased its scientific and display value significantly. Many collectors and institutions, he said, prize the specimen in its found condition. The fact that it has never been cut, never processed, that the crystals are still embedded in the original host rock exactly as they formed. This is significant. It tells a geological story that a cut stone cannot. Edna thought about that. A geological story. Millions of years of pressure and heat and chemistry, and then Calvin's shovel, and then Calvin's hands, and then the back porch. What would a museum pay? She asked. Gerald Voss gave her a range. It was consistent with what Marcus had told her. It was the kind of number that takes a moment to fully enter your mind. And if I didn't want to sell it, she said, but wanted to donate it? He looked at her carefully. A donation to an institution of this caliber, a natural history museum, a geology department, would typically be accompanied by a formal appraisal for tax purposes, an acquisition agreement, conditions of display if you specified them, and sometimes a naming opportunity. Edna was quiet. She looked at the stone, still at the back door. Naming opportunity, she said. The institution might name the specimen or the display for the finder or the donor. She nodded slowly. Something in her face had settled. That was the moment, she told Ruth later. That was when she knew exactly what she was going to do. Donna found out 3 days later, not from Edna, from Terry, who had a cousin who worked in county government, who had heard through a local attorney that someone in Gravel Hollow was having mineral property evaluated. Edna's phone rang at 7:15 on a Tuesday evening. She was washing her dinner dishes. "Mom," Donna said, and the word was already a full sentence. "Hello, Donna. Why didn't you tell me?" Edna dried her hands on the kitchen towel. She had known this call was coming, and she had decided not to rush toward it or away from it. "Because I wanted to understand it fully before I talked to anyone about it." $1 million, Mom. It's an estimate. It hasn't been formally appraised yet. Mom, that's not something you just handle by yourself. You need lawyers. You need someone who understands mineral rights, estate implications, tax consequences. I've already spoken to an attorney, Edna said. Martin Begley, in Hazard. He's been handling our family land paperwork since your father was alive. A pause. Martin Begley is 70 years old. He's 72. He's also extremely competent. Mom. Donna's voice had shifted to the register that meant she was working to stay calm. I'm not trying to take over. I just want to make sure you're protected. Edna looked at the small iron key in the ceramic dish on the windowsill. I know you do, she said. And I appreciate that. But I'm not in need of protection from this, Donna. I'm not confused about what's happening. I've talked to Marcus and Dr. Sutton and Mr. Voss and Martin Begley, and I understand the situation very clearly. Another pause. What are you planning to do? I'll tell you when I've signed the paperwork, so it's settled and not a conversation. The silence on the line was long. Mom, I love you, Edna said. "I'll call you Friday." She hung up. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet. Then she went to the back porch and stood looking at the stone in the light from the kitchen window. "Your daughter found out," she said to no one in particular, or perhaps to Calvin. "She's going to come up here." Donna arrived on Saturday with Terry, who drove and said almost nothing, and brought a grocery bag with food he'd bought in Lexington, because he apparently believed that Gravel Hollow might not have a grocery store. Edna thanked him and put the food away and did not comment on it. They sat in the living room. Donna had a list on her phone of talking points, which Edna recognized because she had taught children who made lists like that. It was a way of managing anxiety, of making certain that important things got said. She did not fault Donna for it. She had the same impulse herself. She just kept her lists in her head. Donna went through them. The concerns about Martin Begley's age and whether a more specialized attorney was needed. The question of whether a sale versus a donation was the right choice financially. The tax implications. The security. What if people found out? What if someone came to the house? Whether Edna had considered all her options. Edna listened to all of it. She had always believed that listening was the first form of respect. When Donna was done, Edna said, "The paperwork is already drafted. Martin and I have gone over it twice. I'm donating the specimen to the Kentucky Natural History Museum in Frankfort. It will be part of their permanent mineral collection. The conditions are that it be displayed intact and labeled with your father's name as the finder, the date of discovery, and the location, this property." Donna opened her mouth. "The acquisition fee," Edna continued, "is enough to repair the roof, cover the land taxes for the next 10 years, and allow me to remain here comfortably. I've set aside a small amount for Ruth. The rest is going into a small educational fund in your father's name for geology programs in rural Appalachian schools." The room was quiet. Terry, who had said almost nothing the entire visit, cleared his throat. Donna looked at her mother for a long moment. Her expression had changed. The anxiety had gone somewhere else, and something underneath it had come to the surface, something less guarded. "You've already decided," she said. "Yes." "When?" "When the man from the auction house told me about naming opportunities," Edna said. "Your father found that stone. He brought it home in his hands. He put it at that door. I don't know what he would have done if he'd known what it was, but I know he would have wanted his name on it. I know that." Donna was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "He would have. You're right." It was, Edna thought, the most useful thing Donna had said all day. "Come look at it," Edna said. "Before it goes anywhere, come see what your father brought home." She took them to the back door. The three of them stood there in the kitchen light, looking at the stone in its place, the screen door resting against it. Edna reached inside and turned on the old lamp, the incandescent one, the one she kept because she liked the quality of the light. The stone shifted. The green went warm, went deep, went toward that burgundy rose that had no right to be in a piece of rock pulled from the ground of a Kentucky pasture. Terry made a sound that was not quite a word. Donna put her hand over her mouth. 40 years, Edna said. Right here, every morning. The paperwork was signed in December. The museum's acquisitions director drove down from Frankfurt personally. A woman in her 50s named Dr. Patricia Howe, who walked around the stone 3 times before speaking and then said it was one of the most significant mineral donations the museum had received in 30 years. 2 museum staff came with padding and a crate. Before they took it, Edna asked if she could hold it one more time. They said of course. It was heavier than it looked, the way it had always been. She turned it in her hands in the kitchen light. She looked at the green surface, the rough crystals, the place where the colors lived that nobody had thought to look for. You were always something, she said quietly. She handed it to Dr. Howe. Marcus Reeves was there that day. He stood on the porch while they loaded the crate into the museum van, hands in his jacket pockets. And when Edna came out, he said, "How do you feel?" She thought about it. Like something is leaving that should leave, she said, and something is staying that should stay. He nodded, like that made complete sense. Maybe it did. The museum mounted the specimen in the first week of March. The display case was positioned near a window that let in strong morning light, and there was a lamp inside the case that could be switched between daylight spectrum and incandescent by a button on the information panel. So, visitors could watch the color change themselves. The label read, Calvin R. Calloway, Gravel Hollow, Kentucky. Found 1979. Donated by Edna Mae Calloway, 2023. Edna drove to Frankfurt for the opening with Ruth, who wore her good blue coat and said very little, but reached over and held Edna's hand when they saw the display, which was enough. The roof was repaired in February. The new shingles were a dark gray that Calvin would have approved of. Edna stood in the backyard while the crew worked and thought about what it meant to fix something that should have been fixed years ago, and whether there was a lesson in that, and decided that there probably was. But she was too old to feel bad about the timing. She gave Ruth the gift she'd set aside, enough to replace the rusted metal roof that had been patching itself since 2015. Ruth had argued. Edna had said that she would listen to the argument on the condition that Ruth understood it wouldn't change anything, and Ruth had laughed and said fine. Donna called more than usual through the spring, but differently, less managing, more asking. She called to say that she'd told the story at Terry's office Christmas party, and 3 people had cried. She called to ask what kind of alexandrite the stone was classified as. She called once to ask if Edna still had the key. Calvin's key, Edna said. Yeah, it's in the dish on the windowsill, same place it's always been. A pause. Good, Donna said. That's good. James would have been 53. Edna thought about that sometimes in the evenings on the back porch with her coffee. She thought about what he might have become. A teacher, maybe, like her, or someone who worked the land, like Calvin. She thought about the fact that the stone had been in the ground before James was born, before she and Calvin had met, before any of it, that it had been accumulating its impossible colors in a Kentucky hillside, while the world moved and changed above it, indifferent and patient in the way that only geology can be. The ground holds things. The ground doesn't forget. One morning in late April, Edna woke at her usual hour and made her coffee and carried it to the back porch as she had done every morning for decades. She opened the back screen door and it swung free in the new spring air. There was no stone. There hadn't been since December. She knew that. She still felt its absence, the way you feel the absence of weight you carried for so long that putting it down takes adjustment. She looked around the back porch. There was a gardening boot, old rubber, caked with last year's mud, sitting near the door. She picked it up and wedged it against the frame. The door held. She stood in the morning air with her coffee. The ridge was going green. The trees at the edge of the pasture were just beginning to leaf. Somewhere down in the holler, a bird she couldn't name was going through its morning repertoire, insistent and musical, as if it had a point to make. Calvin had stood in this same light, had found something in the ground of this place, and carried it home in his hands without knowing what it was, had put it where it was useful, had died not knowing. She thought about that, about what we carry without knowing, about the worth that sits in ordinary things, in a stone, in a doorstop, in a key worn smooth by a thumb, pressing it daily for 15 years, about the number of times someone had stepped over that stone on their way to somewhere more important, about the decades of mornings when she herself had looked at it and seen only what it appeared to be. All of it there, all of it waiting. Alexandrite doesn't announce itself. It holds its light until the light is right, and then it shows you who it always was. If you found something on your land, or if someone in your family held on to something ordinary for decades that turned out to be remarkable, I'd love to hear that story in the comments. And if you've never wondered what's sitting unexamined in a corner of your own life, maybe today is a good day to start wondering. A like means this story finds someone else who needs it. And if you're not subscribed, you're welcome here whenever you are. Edna picked up the boot, looked at it, set it back down against the door frame. The screen door held. The morning held. She drank her coffee in the good light, and a ridge went on, going green. There is a particular quality of November silence in the Kentucky hill country that is different from any other kind of silence. It isn't empty. It has texture, the dry rattle of last leaves, the occasional creak of a tree adjusting to cold, the sound of a creek that has pulled itself down to a murmur after the late summer rains. Edna had grown up in that silence, and she had taught herself not to call it loneliness, because it wasn't. It was the sound of things continuing. In the weeks between Dr. Sutton's visit and Gerald Voss's arrival, Edna went about her life in the ordinary way. She raked the leaves from the backyard in 3 sessions over as many days, because her knees required that she take breaks, and she had long since stopped being embarrassed by that. She made a pot of soup on Sunday that she ate from all week. She graded papers for a tutoring session she did occasionally for a neighbor's granddaughter who was struggling with fractions, because retirement had not eliminated her sense that children needed people who paid attention to them. She looked at the stone each morning. She had looked at it every morning for 40 years without really seeing it, and now she found herself actually looking at the way the early light hit the faceted edges, at the slight greenish tint of the rough surface, at the crystals she had always thought were just interesting texture. She thought about chromium, which Marcus had mentioned. She thought about pressure and time and the geology of the hills around her, which she had spent her entire life within, and knew mostly in the practical terms of a person who had never studied them. What grew well in which soil, where the ground was prone to sliding after heavy rains, which fields drained, and which held water too long. She had taught fourth grade, not geology, but she had always told her students that the most interesting thing about learning was discovering how much the world had done without your awareness of it. The world had made alexandrite in the ground beneath Calvin's fence posts. It had done so approximately 450 million years ago, according to what Marcus would later explain, when the Appalachian region had been subjected to geological events she couldn't fully picture. Pressures and temperatures that bent the story of the rocks into something new. The chromium had been there. The conditions had been there. The crystal had grown slowly in the dark, its color arranged in its molecular structure, like a secret it had no occasion to reveal. Then Calvin had put a shovel into the ground in the spring of 1979 and found it. She turned that over in her mind during those November weeks. The odds of it. Not just that such a stone existed in eastern Kentucky, uncommon but not impossible, Marcus had said. The geological conditions were present, but that it had been found by the particular man who had found it, brought to this particular house, used in this particular way, and preserved intact because the particular woman who lived in the house had never thrown away what her husband had last touched. She was not a mystical woman. She had a practical relationship with faith that her mother had passed to her and that she had maintained without too much drama. But she thought sometimes about what Calvin would make of all this. She thought he would have laughed. Not at the stone. Never at the stone. He wasn't a man who mocked things. He would have laughed at the particular absurdity of it, the way the universe had arranged for one of the rarest gemstone formations in North America to spend 40 years holding open a screen door on a farm in Gravel Hollow, Kentucky, because it was a good weight, and he'd put it there, and nobody'd had cause to move it. He would have found that hilarious, and he would have found it right. Gerald Voss returned in early December with the formal appraisal document. Edna had asked Martin Begley to be present, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table while Voss walked through the report with the methodical clarity of a man who spent his professional life translating geological truth into language that non-geologists could act on. The specimen, the document stated, contained an alexandrite-bearing chrysoberyl crystal matrix of exceptional quality. The largest single crystal was estimated at approximately 18 carats in its current uncut form, with strong, well-defined color change Across the full visible light spectrum, the matrix contained 10 additional smaller crystals, ranging from approximately 2 to 7 carats, with consistent coloration throughout. The host rock was an original formation pegmatite, undisturbed from its natural state. The specimen measured 11 inches by 6 inches by 4 inches and weighed 9.8 pounds. The formal appraised value for insurance purposes, $940,000. The estimated auction value, based on comparable specimens in current collector market, between $1.1 million and $1.4 million, with the caveat that unique specimens of this rarity could exceed upper estimates under favorable conditions. The estimated acquisition value for a natural history museum or academic institution where the intact matrix and provenance added scientific significance, potentially higher than auction value, particularly given the rare documentation of American origin alexandrite. Edna read the document carefully. She asked 2 clarifying questions. Martin Begley asked 3 more. Then she set the document down on the kitchen table and folded her hands over it, and she said, "I want to talk about donation conditions." Voss had dealt with many people in his career who had discovered they were sitting on significant value. Some became immediately transactional, which he understood. Some became paralyzed with indecision, which he also understood. In his 30 years of this work, he had encountered very few who had responded the way Edna Calloway responded, with complete steadiness, a clear sense of what mattered, and questions that went straight to the point without waste. He thought about her, often, afterward. She had a quality he couldn't quite name, except that it felt like the human equivalent of what he valued in a fine specimen: integrity, structure unchanged from origin, every part of it still in its original relationship to every other part. She wanted the specimen donated intact to the Kentucky Natural History Museum. She wanted it labeled permanently with Calvin's name, the date, and the property. She wanted the acquisition fee, whatever the museum offered, for a donation of this significance, which would be substantial, to remain in her control, to be used as she saw fit. She wanted a small educational fund established in Calvin's name for geology programming in rural Appalachian schools. She wanted visiting hours and access to remain free for local school children specifically. "Is that something they can agree to?" she asked Voss. "The museum," he said, "is going to be very eager to agree to whatever conditions you name." Martin Begley drove her to Frankfurt in January to meet with the museum's director. The drive was 2 hours through hill country that looked silver and spare in the winter light. Martin drove and didn't talk much, which Edna appreciated. The director was a man in his early 60s named Dr. Edward Park, who had the manner of a person who had spent his career surrounded by extraordinary things, and had therefore developed a very good poker face for encountering new extraordinary things. But when Edna sat across from him in the meeting room and described the specimen's history, Calvin finding it while digging fence posts, the 40 years as a doorstop, the morning Marcus Reeves had gone still at the back door, she saw something happen in his expression that was not a poker face. It was genuine wonder. The condition of the matrix, he said, is remarkable. In most cases like this, by the time a specimen reaches us, it's been handled, partially broken, cleaned with incorrect materials. People try to improve things, not understanding that the found state is itself the value. But yours, I didn't know what it was, she said, so I didn't try to improve it. He smiled at that. It was a real smile. The acquisition terms they agreed to were generous. The museum's education department reached out within a week of the signed agreement to discuss the Calvin R. Calloway Fund for Earth Science Education, which would provide materials and curriculum support to 10 rural Appalachian school districts per year. Marcus Reeves agreed to serve on the advisory board, which Edna found fitting. She had not known Marcus before October. In 4 months, he had become something she didn't have a precise word for. Not quite a friend, but a person whose appearance in her life she recognized as meaningful in the way that the best kinds of chance meetings turn out to be. He was a careful man who was also genuinely curious, and she respected both qualities. She told Ruth that she thought Marcus reminded her a little of Calvin in the economy of his words and the quality of his attention. Ruth said, "Careful, or you'll adopt him." Edna said, "I'm too old to adopt people." Ruth said, "You adopted me in 1977, and I've never once thought of it as voluntary." Edna had laughed until her eyes watered, which was, in her experience, one of the better uses of an afternoon. The display opened to the public on March the 7th. The museum had put together a small exhibit around the specimen. Photographs of Gravel Hollow, taken by a local photographer, a geological timeline of the Appalachian region, information about alexandrite and how it forms, examples of the color shift displayed using light panels. There was a section about mineral finds in Kentucky more broadly, and in the center of it all, in a case designed to allow visitors to experience both the daylight color and the incandescent color shift, was the stone. Edna stood in front of it and looked at it for a long time. It looked different here. Not wrong, just different. Museum lighting, museum glass, the slight hum of climate control. It was surrounded by context now, by information, by other people moving past and stopping and reading the label and pressing the button to change the light. She watched a girl who was perhaps 9 years old press the button and then make a sound. Not a word, just a sound. When the green went to rose, the girl's grandmother reached over and pressed the button again just to see it happen once more. Edna thought about her own students, about the 4th graders she had tried to teach the habit of looking closely at things, about how the most important thing she had ever told them was not a piece of curriculum, but something she had said once in an ordinary moment that she had not known she was going to say until it was already said, that the world is full of things that are only visible to people who have learned to be patient. She had not known she was talking about alexandrite. The stone had always needed the right light. She had needed the right geologist. Neither was magic. Both were time. Ruth stood beside her. They looked at Calvin's name on the label, Calvin R. Calloway, Gravel Hollow, Kentucky. found 1979. He would have been embarrassed, Ruth said quietly. By having his name on a museum thing, he would have pretended to be embarrassed, Edna said, and then privately been pleased. Yes, Ruth said. That sounds right. Dr. Patricia Howe, the acquisitions director, found Edna near the exhibit entrance and shook her hand and said that the specimen had already been contacted about by 3 universities requesting loan agreements for academic study. She said that the find and the circumstances of its discovery had already been written up for submission to a geological journal. Your husband, Dr. Howe said, made a significant contribution to Kentucky's mineral heritage. Edna thought about Calvin digging fence posts in the spring mud, his hands large and careful, the way he'd washed the stone with the garden hose just to see the color underneath the dirt. He was just fixing the fence, she said. Dr. Howe smiled. Often, that's how it goes. By May, the story had gotten out in the way that stories in small counties get out, not through press releases or television, but through the distributed network of people who know people. Ruth's daughter in Hazard told her book group. A cousin of Donna's mentioned it at work. Martin Begley's secretary apparently told the woman at the pharmacy, who told the woman at the diner, who told everyone who came in for the breakfast special over the course of a week. People called. Edna answered some of them and let the machine get the rest. A man wanted to know if he could walk her back pasture to look for similar stones. She said no politely and twice. A local radio station asked for an interview, which she also declined. A woman in Floyd County wrote her a letter saying that she had a piece of purple glass she'd found in a field, and did Edna think it might be worth something. And Edna wrote back and said she didn't know, but suggested the woman contact the university's geology department, which was a better resource than she was. 3 of her former students reached out. She had not heard from 2 of them in over 20 years. One of them, a man now in his 40s who she remembered as a boy who had loved to collect rocks from the school playground, wrote her a message that was longer than most people write, full of memories of her classroom and a particular lesson she had done with magnifying glasses and ordinary gravel that he said had made him want to be a scientist. He had become a veterinarian instead, but still, she kept that message. She kept a few things, in the end. The key in the ceramic dish. Calvin's tools, still in the barn, still organized. A photograph from their wedding, 1967, where Calvin was looking, not at the camera, but slightly to the left of it, at something she had never been able to identify, with an expression on his face that was so recognizably, specifically him, that she had looked at it thousands of times and it had never grown ordinary. She had not donated the pasture or the house. Those stayed. They were hers, and they would be hers until she decided otherwise. In June, Donna visited by herself, without Terry, without a list on her phone. She arrived on a Friday afternoon and stayed through Sunday. They did not talk about the stone much, or about assisted living. They watched a movie on Saturday evening. They made Calvin's recipe for slow-cooked beans, which Donna only half remembered, but which they reconstructed together from what each of them recalled. They sat on the back porch in the evening and watched the light go down over the ridge in colors that had nothing to prove. Before she left, Donna stood at the back door. The old rubber boot was still there, propping it open. She looked at it for a moment. "That is a terrible doorstop," she said. "It works," Edna said. Donna laughed. It was her father's laugh, short and real and sudden. Edna had not heard it in a long time. "Yeah," Donna said. "Okay, it works." In October, a year almost exactly from Marcus's first visit, Edna drove down to Frankfurt on her own. She told Ruth she was going on an errand, and she told Martin Begley's office she might need a parking permit validated, and she drove the 2 hours with the radio on low and the windows cracked, because the October air in the hills was exactly the right temperature for that. She went to the museum on a weekday morning when it was quiet. She walked through the main hall and past the dinosaur bones that the children always clustered around, and she went to the mineral gallery, and she stood in front of the case. A man was there already, maybe 60, with a notebook, writing something down. He glanced at her and went back to his notes. 2 teenagers on a school trip went past without stopping. Then a woman with a small boy came and stood beside her. The boy looked at the stone. "What is it?" he asked. "Alexandrite," the woman said. "Look, press that button." He pressed it. The lamp changed. The green went to rose, to raspberry, to that deep wine color that had no business being in a rock from a Kentucky fence line. "Whoa," the boy said. "It looks different depending on the light," the woman said. "It changes." The boy pressed the button twice more, going back and forth. Daylight, lamplight, green, red. "Why?" he asked. "It's just how it's made," the woman said. Edna looked at the label, Calvin's name, the date, the property. She thought about the mornings, all the mornings, the screen door and the stone and the coffee and the silence of the ridge before the world started up. All of it so ordinary that she had never once thought to look more carefully. She thought, we spend so much time moving past things, looking for something, stepping over something else. And sometimes the thing we step over turns out to be the thing. The boy pressed the button one more time, watching the stone go from green to red, from ordinary to extraordinary, from what anyone would think at a glance to what it actually was. Edna smiled. That was the whole of it. That was Calvin's stone. And it had always been both of those colors, and all it had ever needed was someone to hold it in the right light. She drove home in the afternoon. She stopped in Berea for coffee and a piece of pie, and she sat alone at a table by the window and watched the traffic on the main road and felt, in a way she would have found difficult to articulate to anyone, entirely all right. The roof was solid. The land taxes were paid. Ruth's roof was fixed. The children in rural Appalachian schools would have better geology materials come fall. Calvin's name was on a museum label, and it was going to be there for a very long time. She left a good tip and drove home. She opened the back door, and the rubber boot held it. She stood on the porch with the last of the afternoon light on the ridge, and she thought, all the things that are there that we don't see. All the things that are waiting to be held up to the right light. If there is something in your life, an object, a person, a piece of land, a memory, that you have been stepping over for so long, it has become invisible. Maybe let this story be the reason you stop and look again. And if you know someone who has been carrying something extraordinary in an ordinary way, tell them. That kind of recognition matters more than most of us understand. Leave a comment and tell me, if you found something like this on your own land, would you sell it, or would you find another way to let it stay in the world? I read every one of them. A like and a subscription keep these stories finding the people who need them. And the stone, Calvin's stone, it holds its light in a museum case in Frankfurt. And the children press the button, and the green goes to red, and every time, without fail, someone says, "Whoa, that's enough. That was always enough."